So I guess since I'm the first speaker, I'm the one with the honor of welcoming everybody tonight. As you're coming in, just find a seat as close to the front as you are comfortable with and settle in. And welcome to everybody. I want to thank each of you for showing that you care, for attending tonight's event, and to some extent, just by being here, just by taking time from your day and showing up, you've accomplished something already. And our community has accomplished something. Because I do believe this is the first time that an event of this stature, with this publicity, has openly dealt with this subject. And the fact that people have come here, and I should mention also, people were here all day long for multiple trainings. Rabbi Yardin was giving trainings since, I think, 8:30 this morning, three-hour trainings in suicide prevention. And now we have this evening here for the wider community. I'm not going to try to talk about everything that this subject entails. Baruch Hashem, we have very, very eminently qualified speakers, and each of them will touch on a different aspect of the issue. I just want to speak about what I said earlier, that we've accomplished something, that you've accomplished something just by showing up, just by being here, just by showing that you care about this issue. There was an article in the New Yorker magazine several years ago about the Golden Gate Bridge, where unfortunately the Golden Gate Bridge is famous as a landmark, but it's also famous as being a place where many people, Rahman al-Islam, have ended their lives. And there was an interview with a forensic psychologist who worked for the San Francisco Police Department, and his expertise was researching the people who had been found after having fallen from the bridge. Obviously, the police have to rule out that there was no foul play. They have to determine that it was indeed what it looks like it is. And so he would do forensic psychology, sort of reconstruct the mind state of the people just to make sure that it was what it seemed to be. And so this doctor, Dr. Jerome Matto, he talked about his experiences for decades and how he became used to these very grim situations. However, he said there was one experience that he could not forget and he could not shake because it affected him in a totally different way than all of the other stories. He said there was one night he was called, there had been a jumper at the bridge that was typical, that was his job, that's what he did. Then they figured out how to ID who it was, and from there they went to the last known residence of the deceased. Again, this is par for the course, this was the job, this is what he did. He says he went into the apartment, one-bedroom apartment where the person had lived. And as he was walking around, he found a piece of paper on the dresser in the bedroom. And he knew what it was. I mean, he'd done this hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times. He knew it was a note. And he picked up the note and he read it. And it was one sentence. It said, "I am walking to the bridge now. If one person stops and says hello to me, I'm turning around and coming home." So Dr. Mato said that he'd been involved in hundreds, thousands of cases, but this was the one he couldn't shake loose. They say that to the world you may be one person, but to one person you may be the world. What I will add to that statement is that sometimes the person to whom you are the world will never tell you, will never have a chance to tell you, you will never know the role that you played in that person's life. But if we can just get out of our own heads, get out of our own busy lives, and we're all busy, Baruch Hashem, with good things, and just be there for each other, just to acknowledge each other's humanity, our basic human dignity, we don't know the lives that we're saving. And so therefore, what I wanted to say is that there are people who know that there's a crowd here tonight. And I want you to know, whatever you hear tonight, and you're going to hear wonderful things, because I said we have speakers who are eminently qualified, but that is a bonus. Just the fact that the community knows that people came out tonight and that there was a crowd here who cares about this issue, I promise you that you're saving somebody's life, at least for today. That they know people came, that people care. There was once a Jew, not particularly religious at all. He went to Vienna, Austria in the 1930s to seek treatment for a very rare condition. Austria, specifically Vienna, was a very cosmopolitan city, and that's where all the big medical schools were at that time and all the big top-notch doctors. So this Jew, a non-observant Jew, he came there, and somehow he had a friend of a friend who knew the Chortkover Rav. They stam from Ruzhin, from Rabbi Yisrael Ruzhiner. And this particular, the Chortkover was also named Rabbi Yisrael, after the Baal Shem Tov, and he had a son, Rabbi Dov Ber, who was named after the Maggid. And both of them there, the Rabbi Yisrael and Rabbi Dov Ber, the Chortkover Rav and his son, lived in Vienna. At any rate, this Yid had been to many specialists, the top specialists in the world, because they were all in Vienna, and no one could help him. Nobody was hopeful about prognosis. So finally, he went to the Chortkover Rav, and he got a bracha, which was very unusual for him. He wasn't religious, certainly not a chassid. And when he got the bracha from the Chortkover Rav told him that he should seek out a specific doctor. He gave him the name, and he was a local family doctor, a GP, just a family doctor, family medicine. Guy who hung up a shingle, and he would deal with colds and flus and whatever families deal with. Now he was surprised because he'd been to the biggest specialists in Vienna, which means the biggest specialists in the world. But now the Chortkover was telling him to go to this, regular doctor. Anyways, he went to the guy, and he healed him. Miraculous recovery. He was completely healed. So he came back to give thanks, and he thanked the Chortkover for the bracha, for the advice, for sending him to a doctor who could finally heal him when all the experts threw up their hands. And he says, but how did it work? I don't understand. the experts couldn't do it, and this guy did it. So Rabbi Yisrael, the Chortkover Rav, said, Mikan, this is from last week's Parsha, we just laned yesterday in every shul in the world. Mikan shenitna reshus l'reifa lirapais. From here, from this verse, from the verse Verapa yirape, the sages learn out shenitna reshus, the permission was granted to the doctor to heal. So the guy didn't really understand what does that have to do with the price of tea in China. So Rabbi Yisrael's son, Rabbi Dov Ber, he explained. He says, Mikan, and he pointed, from here, from this room, from this Yechidus Zimmer, from this room where so many Jews came and poured out their hearts, and my father, the Rebbe, listen to them. From this place where so many Jews came seeking blessing, that's where the permission comes to the healer to heal. So you're seeing specialists. Specialists are on their own. But when you come to a place where a Jew can bare his soul and his heart, and a Gutta Yid can listen and bench him, now we have the Eibishter on our side. Now the healer has permission to heal. And now we're dealing with powers way above human capability. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome, to introduce the founder of Neshamas, a member of our community whose shlichus is healing and who has been given reshus, l'rapos, Dr. Eli Rosen. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. There are plenty of chairs if you're still standing. Neshamas, an organization that was begun about 3 years ago now, has accomplished a few things. But the thing that we've accomplished most is opening the dialogue, is allowing people to talk, allowing people who are isolated, lonely, and suffering to share, to be validated, allowing principals in schools, teachers, others, to hear that there is a problem and that it's our problem, and we'll manage with it. I have incredible faith in this community that we will accomplish what we need to accomplish, and we will be able to be truly inclusive and help all of those who need help feel once again that they are not alone. Suicide perhaps is the ultimate end of despair. And surely this feeling of being alone is a driver to that kind of despair. The story that Rabbi Shei Staub spoke about with the man who said, if one person greets me, I want to invite everybody to show as much caring as they can on every level to every human being, and particularly all of those who live within this community. We can do it. Having said that, I want to introduce Herschel Stevens. Herschel is a young man who grew up in Toronto, who now lives in Crown Heights, and Herschel will tell us his own story.
Thanks. I'm here to share my story for 3 reasons. Every time I talk about what I've been through, I own it a little bit more. It takes a little bit less control of it becomes a little bit less of what happened to me and becomes more of something that I've experienced and overcome to the extent that I can talk about it and try to help. The second reason why I'm sharing is because there are people out there who need to know that it's safe to talk. As Dr. Rosen was saying, isolation is one of the hardest things, and feeling like talking would be a burden to someone or you'd be shunned is one of the hardest things. And the only way that we can get better with this is by sharing and talking and reaching out. And the third reason is because it's a more global reason, but I think it needs to be talked about and it needs to be top of mind and it needs to be something that everyone's aware of. So here's my story. I was born in Toronto, in a very Hasidische, loving and affectionate home. As a kid, I can remember myself as a diligent, mostly quiet, and a good student, a good kid. I always wanted to do the right thing. When I was 12 years old, it was the summer of 7th grade. I went to summer camp where I was molested. And when I got back, I wasn't the same. We had the same teacher in 7th grade and then again in 8th grade. And I remember him telling me in 8th grade that I wasn't the same kid that came back for the second year. When I look back and I try to identify what I was feeling, it's hard to put words on the emotions that I was feeling because I didn't have the vocabulary. And it went on for years. Explosive anger, confusion, rebelliousness, anything a figure of authority told me, I wanted to smack her right back in their face. I had a very low self-esteem, and it was hard. It was hard because I would look in the mirror and see that I wasn't who I've been identifying with. I always thought myself as a good kid, and I was reacting. I couldn't identify how I was feeling or why I was feeling it. A family friend and a community member in Toronto reached out to my parents. He saw me just around in shul or whatever, and he realized that I was angry. He realized that I was depressed. And he asked my parents, what's going on? My parents didn't really understand why. They tried asking me, but I could never put it into words. I could never explain it because I didn't understand it. But he used to take me out of yeshiva, Shir Aleph Masifta, during Seder, smack in the middle of the day. Of course, I wasn't going to say no to leaving Seder for an hour. And we'd sit in his car, and we talked for months. Every week after week, we talked about everything, and we talked about nothing. Until after a good few months, I felt comfortable enough to tell him what happened to me, and that's what really got the ball rolling in my journey to getting better. I had a very hard time being comfortable telling my parents about my molestation, and this community member went out, sat my parents down, and spoke to them, told them. And I remember the first thing that my parents did was pick me up from yeshiva, and we drove to the local pizza store on a Motzei Shabbos, and I sat in the back seat, trying not to make eye contact, and I don't remember if they even turned around. They knew how uncomfortable I was, and they told me that they loved me no matter what, and that it was good that I spoke up because now we can start getting better, and that I had their unwavering support. And together I felt like I was part of a team, and I was able to start looking for a therapist and start talking about what happened to me, start explaining to people who needed to be explained to why I was acting out. Things really came to a head when I left for Shir Gimel Masefta. I left town, tried to get a fresh start in a new yeshiva. There was a bunch of us in our grade that wanted to go to a certain yeshiva for Zal. 12 of us applied, if I can remember correctly, and 11 got accepted. I didn't. And being fragile and volatile that I was, I took it really badly. It was around Lag Baimer time. And I went to the store and I bought 2 big bottles of pills, Advil. And I said I was gonna take it, fall asleep, and hopefully not wake up. Thankfully, I've always had a very hard time hiding how I feel. And the Rosh Yeshiva at the time saw me walking, and he pulled me over. It was right after night Seder. I was going to the dorm. And he pulled me over and he said, "What's going on? Are you happy?" I said, "No." And he said, "If you're not happy and you're depressed," like he wanted me to know, and he said this. He said, "Your health is more important than whether you put on tefillin today." That was earth-shattering for me at the time because that was all we were taught. You got to do what you got to do. You have to stick with it. I don't think I fully grasped the severity or like the weight of that statement, but life is more important than tefillin in that moment. And he took me to the hospital. It was a psych ward. We stayed until 3 in the morning until I got there. My father at the time had planned a ski trip, and he had flown to Calgary from Toronto, and he was in the car on his way to ski, and he got a call that I was being admitted, and he turned the car around on the highway in Alberta and drove back to the airport, took the first flight back to Toronto, picked up the car, and drove 10 hours to come pick me up. I started therapy in earnest after that, medications, and really trying to deal with the ramifications or like the effects that the molestation did to me. Eventually I was out of yeshiva. I found myself with a very low self-esteem, and I put myself in a lot of difficult situations, relationships. I was very triggered, very anxious, a lot. And when things got really painful and when things got really hard, the attempts started. I'll just share a few of the stories. There was another family friend, someone from the community. He dealt with a program called The Center in Toronto. It was a place for teenagers to go hang out once a week. He became a good friend, and I remember sitting at home alone and really didn't want to be here. And I took every pill that we had in the house and I put them on the kitchen table, evenly spaced and color-coded. But I didn't want to die. I just didn't want to be here. And I called him, and I just said, I need you to come here. And that's what he did. He walked into the house. He saw the pills on the table. And he just said, let's go, we're going. We're gonna go sit in a coffee shop and just hang out. We ended up sitting and hanging out until 6 in the morning. He was a married man with kids, with a pregnant wife, and he took the time to sit with me and joke around with me and distract me and make me not feel alone. There was another time just before Sukkot, it was still in the 18 minutes. And I was already kind of on suicide watch, where your parents don't let you out of their sight for too long. But I got away, and I was standing at the train tracks. I remember it was drizzling. I was waiting for the next train. And my parents called me, tried to find out where I was. I didn't want to share my location. But it was, I'm not sure if it was still in the 18 minutes or it was already Chag. But it didn't matter because my friend got a call from my mother saying, please, just try to get through to him. And he called me and I picked up and I was already ready to argue with him and philosophize. And he said, where are you? And just the care in his voice and the pure concern was all I needed to hear. And I just told him where I was. He was wearing a suit ready for Yantiv, and he jumped the fence in the rain, got covered in burrs and grass coming to get me from the train tracks. That night, me and my dad got into a taxi and we went to the hospital. Another time, I was very alone. I lived on my own. There was a TV cable that would stick out of the ceiling for months. It felt like it was taunting me. I tied it around my neck, stepped off the bed, and the TV cable fell out of the ceiling. There are other times, but what I remember from that entire time was the constant fantasies where everything you looked at became a way to kill yourself with, and the obsession with just not wanting to be here when the pain is too much. And I've always felt that, and like looking back now, when I felt a fire, an emotional fire inside my body or inside my mind, I thought that the best way to put out the fire was just to knock the whole house down. But I've learned so much since then. I've learned that people in my community cared about me. They saw something was off, and they reached out, and they sat with me for months and didn't give up, even though I didn't want to share. I learned that my parents will love and accept me no matter what. I learned that rabbis can recognize that mental health is more important than putting on tefillin. And doing what looks right. I learned that my friends have always loved me and have been there for me, and sometimes didn't have to say anything or say the right thing, but always showed concern and support and love. I don't know. I don't know if things get better all the time forever after this. I know I will struggle, and I know that I'm going to have hard times. But I do know that I've done the work, and I've reached out to my support system enough that I can trust them. And I know that if I would have ended it then, I wouldn't appreciate the good that I am now. And even though it might sometimes be bad, it's still, I appreciate my life now. And I appreciate everyone that's in it. I know that I can put out a fire without knocking the whole house down. Therapy helped, talking helped, talking now will help. And I want to thank everyone for coming, because just being here shows that you cared. I can't say how many times a genuine good Shabbos in shul or a smile and a handshake went a long way to make me feel like I was a part of something. We have a community, we have a communal infrastructure. We should use it to save lives. I want to thank my support system, my parents, my family, my friends, my teachers, my rabbis. Thank you, Neshamas, for giving a platform and giving a voice to people who need it. And again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Herschel. You taught us a lot. The pain is palpable. If anybody in the audience, if anybody watching this online feels that life is not worth living, feels alone, destitute, desperate, there's a place to call. You need to call. You can call the Neshamas hotline. There are multiple other places to call, but certainly the Neshamas hotline is a place to call. Come to my office. Tell them it's an emergency. Reach out. People do care. And for all of us, we need to show that we care every day. I want to introduce our next speaker. Yarden Blumstein. Yarden is a Chovevei Torah graduate. 16 years ago, he went as a shliach to West Bloomfield, Michigan, and got involved in the Friendship Circle doing teen work. Within that framework, Yarden became particularly interested in what he terms isolation work. There's that isolation. And when one is involved in isolation work, and particularly with teens, obviously that brings one into the realm of suicide prevention. Yarden trained under a system called Living Works, and now is a suicide prevention educator and trainer. Today there were 3 different sessions here. More than 120 educators, principals, shul, rabbis got a basic training in suicide prevention. Yarden is going to give us not the same kind of training, but hopefully a perspective on the problem and how to manage it. Yarden.
I want to give a shout out and thank a community that had 120 people on a Sunday with their lives being so busy to take 3 hours out of their day to invest in a community to make it a safer place for people struggling in isolation and contemplating suicide. Thank you. I want to thank a community that had a waiting list of several people saying, when's the next training? How do I make my way in? Because there's nothing better to do with my time than make this a safer place for other people. That's an amazing community, a humbling community, and I'm humbled to be standing before you. And I want to thank Herschel for all that you just shared. I cannot begin to figure out how I got placed after you. Thank you. I was told to use the framework of story to try to elucidate or share a point, and I want to try to do that. In 1994, in Michigan, in West Bloomfield, Michigan, there was a young man struggling with addiction, and he drug overdosed and unfortunately passed away. And there were several components that played into it, but the family thought that one of the components was the lack of friendship in his life. And they said, we need to start a program, an organization that supplies friendship to people struggling with addiction and other life crises. And the organization that we all know of Children with Special Needs was born to help people with addiction and other life crises. It was called Friendship Circle. Since then, Rabbi Levi Shem Tov addressed and walked around engaging with people that he felt were isolated. Addiction was an extremely isolated population. Unfortunately, I would argue that today it still is. His wife, Basi Shem Tov, said there's other people struggling in isolation. She approached people with special needs. Just to give you context, 2 miles away from where Friendship Circle is located, in 1994, there was a person who felt that their child who had autism might be contagious. They didn't want other people to catch it. That's isolation. They kept them in their homes, saying they cannot be out in the public. How could I bring this to society? Thank God the world has embraced special needs so much. And Friendship Circle has looked at its mission, and one of the populations of extreme isolation is teens. Another population of extreme isolation today is everyone else. Isolation is prevalent in so many ways, shapes, and forms. Some will connote or denote that our population is the most isolated population to ever exist. Amazon's in the middle of doing a study saying that since we're isolated, one of the things we do when we're isolated is shop more. And they're trying to figure out that while that, yes, that helps business, but what can they do to help build community? In a world where we have so much connectivity, so much instant contact and communication, how are we so isolated? And organizations like Neshamas, highlighting the point of connection, are trying to combat that, trying to build community, friendship, and support. I was hired by Friendship Circle, and my mission was to be a friend to people, and I've been trying to do that ever since. And right now I focus on teens, trying to offer them friendship, and that's what I want to talk about today, the power of friendship as a tool towards connection? How do we build connectivity? If we're someone who's struggling and isolated, how do we reach out and ask for that friendship? Herschel mentioned a lot of concepts from the therapeutic wheel. I just want to touch on them for a moment. Yes, therapy is one of them, super important. And so is psychiatry. And so is friendship. There's a study that says having a trusted adult during one's teenage years is the most impactful, positive tool towards a teen's development. Having a trusted adult. How do we put ourselves out there and say, I'd like to be that trusted adult? How do we talk to the youth in our lives and say, who is your trusted adult? How do we talk to our children and say, I hope you have a trusted adult? How do we make this language? How do we surround ourselves with language of solution? About being okay to hear a challenge and then offering solution. How do you make this a framework? When someone's down, we make it okay. We can talk to them, we can give them support, we can even offer them friendship. And how do we explain the power of friendship? I want to share a brief story that happened to me a year and a half ago. I woke up in the morning, I don't know if you ever do this, and I looked at my phone, I looked at my calendar, and I wanted to see how busy I was going to be and what time lunch would be. And on that day, lunch was going to be at 10 p.m. And I was looking at it, and I was like, wow, I should sleep in, because anyways, it's going to be a long day. And I remember thinking, okay, let me just brain prepare for what I had to get through. Meetings, and busy and productive are not the same things, and I was living in the world of busyness that day. And in the middle of the day, a parent reached out to me, they called, and they said their child had just been checked into a psychiatric unit, and they requested that I go visit them. And without thinking in the robotic framework that I lived within, I said, oh wow, that's really isolating and really lonely, I've got time tomorrow. And they said, what about today? And I said, well, I'm busy until very late at night, I'm sorry. And then I hung up the phone and I realized that my entire mission statement of being there for people in isolation, what am I busy with when I could be productive? So I reached back and I called, I said, please don't call back your kid. I'm coming. I just don't know when yet. So I proceeded to cancel 3 meetings in the middle of the day to create a nice window of time. I thought I'd have a wonderful visit with this child. And I proceeded to drive over to the hospital, and I hit bumper-to-bumper traffic on a minor street where there was nowhere to turn around. I sat there for an hour. I remember watching my phone, which was hanging with the directions, with the arrival time being pushed back minute by minute. It was only 15 minutes away, and yet I never got there. The mother was calling me every 15 minutes, when are you coming? The kid's anxious, they're excited. I said, I don't know. I'm not really sure what's going on. I've never experienced this type of traffic before. The meeting after that was one I couldn't miss, and I called the mom finally. I said, I'm not going to make it. But I promise you, your kid's going to wake up in the morning and there'll be a note from me that I came at some point tonight. Let your kid know that as soon as I can get there, I will get there. And if they're awake, I'll visit them, and if not, I'll leave a note. I don't know how you get into hospital after a certain time. I think that time's 7 p.m., especially the psychiatric units, but that was just a minor inconvenience at that point. And I continued my day. I had to go to a meeting down in downtown Detroit, then I had to go somewhere else. I remember at 10 p.m. at night, I had finished my day. I sat down, and I was like, I'm going to eat lunch. And my wife called me. She reminded me that I wasn't going to eat lunch until I finished going to the hospital. So I hopped into my car and I drove down to the hospital. And I walked in, and the nurse receptionist looks at me and she says, hello, what are you doing here? I said, I'm here to visit somebody. And she says, that's cute. That was 3 hours ago. What are you doing here now? And I said, well, there's somebody who needs me to visit, and there's a law that clergy can visit whenever they want. I'm not sure if this is a law, but at that point it was. And I was going to walk in. I was going to visit this kid. She smiled and she says, very nice. Where's your clergy badge? Of course, I didn't have a clergy badge. And I looked at her and I said, oh, I left it on my desk. It's only 45 minutes away. Would you like me to come back at 11:30? She looked at me and she says, okay, I'll let you in. You can find him on your own. I was like, thanks. So I began to walk down a hospital hallway, poking into rooms. It's the most awkward thing possible. Lights are off, lights are on. You're walking past the curtain. Oops, sorry, wrong room. Keep going down. And finally, I find this kid. He's the second in a room. The light is off, and the first one, that little curtain divider that keeps complete privacy. And then you go past that, and there's this kid sitting. He's beaming with joy. You made it. I'm so excited. I felt so good, felt so proud of myself. My ego was doing well. And I look at the kid, I say, what can I do for you? And he says, you did it. That's all I wanted. I wanted to see you. I wanted to know that someone cares. Thank you. Well, I wasn't going to dip out. I wasn't going to ditch right away. So what do you do when you have nothing to speak about? You speak about sports. There was a major game coming up between the two rival schools in Michigan. Michigan and Michigan State were about to play a football game. I asked him who's going to win. He starts going on an elaborate explanation about why Michigan's going to win. I couldn't care less. I just wanted lunch. And he's going on, and this kid behind the curtain is turning over in his bed. And finally, I turned to the kid. I said, it's late at night. I'll come back tomorrow, but I'm glad I made it. your roommate's trying to sleep. At which point, the roommate called out. He says, you think I'm trying to sleep? I just can't deal with the fact that this kid thinks Michigan's going to win. Michigan State is going to destroy. And next thing I know they're having this argument. I'm like, guys, stop. For a few minutes, it rages on, and then finally the kid behind the curtain says, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure. He says, are you really a rabbi? I says, kid, it's 10:30 at night. Who else shows up at a hospital? Of course I'm a rabbi. He looks at me, he turns from behind the curtain and says, can I look at you? I said, sure. He opens the curtain. He looks at me, he says, oh my gosh, you're really a rabbi. I was like, yeah, I am. He says, let me tell you a little story. This was in November last year. He says, in June or July, I don't remember, he said he checked into the hospital because he was struggling with suicidality and a lot of other emotional challenges. And he couldn't take the first step that would allow him to continue his journey. And every day he woke up and the nurses told him, you need to begin your journey, you need to do the work. And they weren't willing him to advance or release in any way, shape, or form. He had been there for months. And that morning he woke up, he says, I don't know if I believe or not, but if there's a God, today is a good day to give me a sign. And he says he waits the entire day and there's no sign. And he's trying to go to sleep at night. And in walks a rabbi to his room. He says, I got everything I needed. And he closes the curtain and goes to sleep. And then I turned to the kid I was actually visiting. And I said, now I think your roommate's actually sleeping. I'm going to check myself out. And I walked out. I remember driving home thinking, what would have happened if I didn't show up? I had so many excuses and so many reasons, so many valid reasons why I didn't need to show up that day. Yet I wouldn't have been there for the one person I don't know his name and don't know where he's up to in his life. And yet I need to show up. I challenge you, hearing Hershel's story, how do we show up? How do we at least be there for those who are trying to utilize us to take the next step of recovery in their lives? How do we have a smile for someone who might be down in the moment? How do we have support, a word of support, whatever that might look like, to somebody who's struggling along their path looking for the next step towards their recovery? I think the very fact that people are showing up today is the first step towards that process. And we need to take that further past tonight. I think part of that's changing the language, changing the conversation. It goes from there so much further. There's so many different people in our lives, and we say, what is a reach out going to do? How important is that reach out? And yet people's lives are depending on it, even if it's just for today. At least they lived today. And I challenge you to pick that stone up or pick that flag and wave it so other people can rally around behind it. There's a story I once heard, I don't know if it's true or not, though I don't know how much that matters, about a boy who was sitting on a beach, and there were starfish all over the beach. And he was picking up the starfish one at a time. He was tossing them back in the water. This older man comes up to him and he says, kid, what are you doing? Look up and down the beach. There's thousands of starfish. And I don't know if you learned this or not. This happens every single day. Your actions are completely futile and pointless. To which the kid bends down and picks up a starfish and tosses it back in the water and looks to the guy and says, to that starfish, I meant the world. I challenge you today, just for today, be the world to a starfish that's out there. Build that connection. Allow them to take their next step in their journey, and who knows, maybe they'll be a speaker here one night. Or maybe we won't have nights like this anymore because the community will be transformed and changed to ways that this event would just be a rudimentary part of our life. That would be amazing and fascinating. If I can go out of business, that would be amazing and fascinating. I want to talk about a couple solution pieces, share another couple of stories possibly, and hope to educate this idea that we have to offer through friendship, community, and support. There's so many things that we think about that fall within the world of being therapeutic or supporting or recovery that sometimes fall by the wayside and aren't mentioned. I think it's so important to mention that. First of all, there's a word, it's called resiliency. How do we build resiliency? We work out physically, and sometimes, we tear muscle, which is a healthy process. But sometimes we lift too much, and it tears our muscle. And then we have to go through recovery. We have to build stronger muscles or bones or do the process to heal. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to our brain, which is a muscle, which constantly tears itself and builds resiliency through different daily events, as stresses, etc., when that muscle tears, we think we're broken. We don't look at it as a muscle that needs to be healed. We don't look at it as a muscle that needs support or approaches or therapeutic rapport. We look at it as something that made us broken. I don't know why. It's a muscle and it can heal. We need to introduce resiliency into our conversations. We need to introduce transparency into our conversations. How to become transparent about things. And we need to introduce consistency within our lives, within our messages, within our communications. I once heard a teaching that someone told me in the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe that an atom is the smallest building block of matter. An atom has protons, neutrons, and electrons, which is just a small percentage of the reality of an atom. Most of its space or the speed that they move about. And yet the speed that those small amounts move about creates electronic force fields that creates reality. So I'm standing at a podium speaking, most of it's actually space. And yet somehow that becomes a wall in our life. And it was highlighted how our day-to-day actions and our daily lives are actually very minor action and a lot of moving those actions around inside our heads. Sometimes for the negative, sometimes we exist in the problem of pushing around a negative thing again and again in our head until it becomes an actual reality in our life, as hard as this podium is, or as hard as the wall is to walk through. And yet the same thing is true for positivity. A small positive action, a small positive offering, a small text or phone call to someone in need could become the atom, the small portion of an atom, becoming its actual definition of reality and physicality for someone today. And I think if we can use that to push around positivity rather than negativity, we can create walls and structures of support, growth, and health. And I want to challenge us about how we can start doing that. How do we start creating a community of support? I was once flying somewhere to do a suicide prevention training, as I was doing today, and I had a stopover flight, and I remember I landed in the airport. It was a long story, but the flight got delayed, and of course they redirected everybody on the flight except me. And 3 hours I was supposed to sit in this airport that its entire existence, I don't think there were any flights that actually stayed at that airport. It was completely a connector airport. And not only that, I remember thinking that I was going to get in right in time to miss my training. I might as well just catch a flight home. And at first I was a little bit worked up, I was a little bit disheveled, and then finally I pulled myself together. I said, you know what? I got to daven. It's a good time to pray. I found a little quiet niche of the airport to sit in and daven. It wasn't hard because the whole thing was quiet and empty. And I remember sitting there and I got involved. I had time. I had 3 hours. Why not take my time and pray? And I looked up in the middle of one time my davening, and there was this person sitting there, and they were staring at me. I was like a little bit concerned about it. I'm like, what are you doing? I'm not that entertaining. And the person kept staring at me. And I figured, well, if they were going to do something, they probably would have done it already, and I'm davening. So I finished davening. I'm taking off my talis. I'm unwrapping my tefillin. I turned to the guy. I was like, so what's up? He's like, what do you mean, what's up? And I'm like, you're watching me. And he says, oh, I probably should have told you. He says, I was having a really tough time today. I was struggling. And I was looking for support. I was looking for inspiration. And I actually served in Vietnam. And in my unit, there was a Jewish guy who used to pray every day. And all of us didn't have words of prayer. So every morning we would get up with him. We would sit around him, and he would pray, and we would connect. He says, and today I was walking the airport, and I couldn't find the solution in life. I was missing some of that purpose. And I remember thinking it'd be amazing if there was a guy here that I can connect with through prayer. And then I see you. And I sat down, and I started connecting. I didn't think to ask you. I just figured that was supposed to happen. I remember thinking about it. Was that why I missed my flight? Was that why I got delayed? But then the question becomes, is how do I become that? How do that become my message? How does that become my mantra? How does it become the beacon of light that I want it to be? There's a lot of other things I could have done with that time that probably wouldn't have inspired that guy. How do I make sure that what I'm doing is what I want it to be? And we're talking about suicide, something we spent a long time on today. You know, there's different movements out there about language. Some language we do use, we don't use, and over time it changes and it adapts. I know there's been a movement in America about not using the R word. And lately I've heard that there's a movement about not using the C word, committed, in regards to suicide. Committed is associated with a crime, and why do we have to judge people for a mental health challenge or a mental illness such as suicide? And some people are for it and some people are against it, and I try my best not to use it, because why do I need to be someone who causes someone else pain unintentionally? And I once gave a lecture on this to a group of teens, and one of the teens later that year was a senior in high school just a few years ago, and someone in their grade took their life. And there was 150 teens on a group chat. They're all talking together, and someone says, I can't believe so-and-so committed suicide. And this teen responded and said, you know, in regards to suicide, we try not to use the word committed because it's not a crime. They lost a battle to disease, it's a challenge, and let's choose other language when talking about them. And this first teen said, are you really trying to lecture me? And they kicked them out of the group. The teen was upset, they were distraught. They said, I was just trying to change the conversation or bring solution to a challenge. And about 45 minutes later, a different teen from the group called up this teen and said, in my entire life, no one's respected me for my daily challenge except for you. Thank you. Simple change in language, simple change in response can create such levels of connection, of support. And I think there's so many different frameworks of how we can do that, how we can ask people if they're okay. It's interesting, you walk down the street, how are you? Fine, how are you? Fine, and none of us know how either one's doing. How do we open up and actually ask those questions? How do we get beyond the fine that doesn't mean anything? And how do we actually learn how people are doing and then be there to support them? And then for those of us who are having a rough day or are struggling, how do we open up and trust the community to be there for us, to create that connection? There's a teaching in Judaism about tzedakah, that tzedakah is two people doing righteous things. One is giving and one's receiving. And some people argue that the receiving is the harder side of the mitzvah of tzedakah. I think the same thing is true here too. In isolation, there's people that are giving and there's people that are receiving. And I think it's harder to receive than to give the community, friendship, and support that people need. And I want to challenge you that if that's you, allow people the opportunity to connect with you. Allow people the opportunity to have friendships with you and to be there with you. I think sometimes there's a fear. Fear is an acronym. It stands for face everything and run, because that's what fear causes to happen. I think sometimes there's a fear about getting involved, about asking, about my role in things. What's my role? And I challenge you that fear could be an inhibitor. It can also be one of the greatest enablers that exist. It can motivate us to do things that we never thought were possible. And I challenge you to face that fear and figure out how I can get involved, how I can start making a difference, how I can start trying to connecting, how can I define my role in this relationship. People ask me all the time, I'm not a social worker. I am a rabbi. What's my role in things? My role is community, friendship, support, and spirituality. And those are things that are not talked about enough. Those are things that are not supported enough. And that's my role in things. And that's each one of our roles, to figure out how to face the fear and create a role for us. There was an article in the Huffington Post about a year ago, and it argued that when someone goes into a state of crisis, every support in their life becomes a therapist. Everybody takes on the therapist role. And while there's a place for a therapist, and if you take away that I'm negating therapy in any way, shape, or form, I apologize. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm also saying that there's other supports that need to be there. There's friendship, there's siblings, there's community, there's family, there's spiritual guidance, there's community service. There's so many pieces of this puzzle. We need to make sure that we're doing our part to be a part of that circle, to be a part of that loop. The idea that a puzzle isn't just one piece repeated time and time again, yet each of us have our puzzle piece. And some of us are struggling to figure out how our piece fits in, and other of us, unfortunately, are trying to get that piece to fit in where it doesn't belong. We need to work with that piece to find its strength, to find its beauty and its place in the puzzle, because without that, we're not complete. This past week was Parsha Shkolem, and we know the messages behind that. It's empowering someone to find their place, because if they don't find their place, our place isn't complete. We're lacking because of it. And therefore, together, we can build community. I want to touch on just a couple other points before I wrap up today. One, I think it's important to note that we talked about this in a couple of different ways. It's important to note that there's a variety of therapeutic approaches out there. I heard today, I did a couple of trainings today, and I heard people saying this person tried therapy for years. If you know somebody, or if it's you yourself, and you're sitting there and saying, I tried therapy for years, my first question to you would be, what forms of therapy have you tried? That's a blanket umbrella statement to a vast area of approaches. And I think it's important to explore what those things are. They're not the same. They're not one. It's not one language. That's like saying I met one rabbi and I met the whole world. We need to start exploring what that looks like. What are we trying? What are we mixing up? And how do we find the approach that works for somebody so they can begin their journey? And as Herschel said, I think it's a daily journey. Yet we need to support them throughout that journey. The other thing, And I've heard this a few times today, and I want to highlight it for a second. Sometimes I think we think that we can't reach out to a therapist about our friend because of HIPAA laws. We can't support or get involved. And I want to challenge you, there's nothing holding you back from calling a therapist and leaving a voicemail about how your friend is doing if that's their therapist. The therapist doesn't have to respond, they don't have to engage with you, but that update might be helpful to them. Sometimes people think somebody has a therapist, so there's no more role for me in the picture anymore. I know several therapists out there that are trying to build a support team, in which case there's a complete job for you that no one's stepping up to do. How do I reach out to that person and say, I want to be a part of your solution? Help me define what that part looks like. Help me define what job I can do to be there for you. Tell me how I can be helpful to you. Maybe it's a text once a week. Maybe it's going with to a therapy session with you. Maybe it's a support on an evening when you need it. I don't know. Let me know. I want to be there for you. How to become a part of that language. I want to wrap up with one brief story, and then I want to pass it on to whoever's after me. I think sometimes, which Herschel identified in his story, I think sometimes we look at people and we wonder how they got there. And we spend a lot of time trying to identify, how did you get to this state of being? And I think, unfortunately, that's a lot of time and resource we're spending not being there for the person. If they choose to tell us a story, if they choose to tell us a history, if that's what they want to do, that's their choice. Ultimately, the question isn't what makes somebody who they are, it's how can I help them today? I think we can change that language, if we can change that approach, we can start figuring out where we fit into that puzzle today. I want to wrap up, and I want to thank you for your time, attention, and I want to pass it on to nobody. Thank you.
Short and bitter, but I think it's all been said. I think we all have our homework, and let's just conclude the evening with all of the profundity that it had and go home and think about how we can reach out and connect with somebody who really needs it. Have a good night. Thank you for coming.